Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Cut Rate Commander, the series where we take a look at low-price commanders and make budget decks with them. My name is Grazzet, and today we'll be looking at a build featuring the undisputed ruler of New Vegas, Mr. House, President and CEO. As usual though, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you like this content. Consider supporting the channel directly via my Buy Me a Coffee or Game Nerds affiliate link in the description if you really like it, and be sure to stick around until the end of the video to see what builds we'll be covering next. So with that out of the way, let's start by taking a look at the commander and playstyle. Mr. House, President and CEO is a 0/4 artifact creature human that costs Mardu that has the following two abilities. Firstly, whenever we roll a 4 or higher, we create a 3/3 colorless robot artifact creature token, or if we roll a 6 or higher, we create that token and a treasure token. And secondly, we can pay 4 and tap him in order to roll a 6-sided die, plus 1 additional die for each mana spent from treasures to activate this ability. Breaking down his core stats, Mr. House possesses a relatively low CMC, a very defensive 0 power above average toughness stat block for his cost, and a pair of abilities focused around us rolling dice in order to generate us value in the form of repeatable decent sized artifact creature creation to build up our board with, and a ramp in the form of treasure, provided of course we can keep rolling high. But the important thing to keep in mind here, despite his own ability rolling 6-sided dice, is that Mr. House doesn't care about the kind of dice being rolled to proc his passive, only that the result of that die be 4+ and 6+ respectively, meaning that we can, rather thematically, stack the odds in our favor by using cards that let us roll d20s to dramatically increase our odds of proccing said passive, increasing our robot creation odds from 50% to 85% and our treasure creation from roughly 16% to 75% in comparison to 6-sided dice. This in turn will enable us to build up our board and ramp using Mr. House's passive much more reliably, the latter of which we can then pump right back into Mr. House's second ability, which, for 4 treasure worth of mana, will statistically net us 2 to 3 bodies with 3/3 worth of stats each and a treasure back, which is not too shabby, while also proccing and benefiting from any other die rolling payoffs that we run alongside him. So clearly, Mr. House wants us to go all in on die rolling in order to get the maximum value out of his abilities, wanting us to roll dice as often as possible, preferably d20s, but settling for anything bigger than d6s to tip the scales in our favor, to net us as much board presence and ramp as possible. And in this build, we'll be more than happy to oblige him, running a variety of repeatable d20 rolling effects in order to proc Mr. House's passive reliably turn after turn, as well as a decent selection of die rolling payoffs to help load the dice in our favor even more. However, all this dice rolling will only be part of the equation here, since we'll still need a way to turn all the artifact tokens Mr. House creates for us into an actual win condition. And while admittedly turning an army of robots sideways is an option, we'll be aiming to make their job easier by including a selection of payoffs that turn said tokens and artifacts into even more damage as they come down or die off to soften up our opponents even further, alongside ways to turn our spare artifact tokens into value to ensure we have the resources necessary to keep the pressure up throughout the course of the game, and a small suite of protection sources to help keep Mr. House alive for as long as possible, since our opponents will undoubtedly start gunning for him once he starts generating us too much value, giving Mr. House all the time he needs to locate the platinum chip and make his securitron army unstoppable. So let us make our way into the wastes of the Mojave and to the rebuilt ruins of Las Vegas, now better known as New Vegas, the empire that solely exists thanks to the efforts of Robert House. Pre-war, he was the definition of a self-made man, starting off with not a penny to his name and amassing billions via his company, Robco Industries, by the time he was 30. But he, unlike the general public, knew the good times would not last, as his future projections showed that a nuclear war was all but inevitable. As such, he devoted his life to ensuring that the city of Las Vegas would survive the apocalypse, equipping the city with state-of-the-art missile countermeasures to disable incoming nuclear warheads, and, to ensure that there would be a leader for this new world, hardwired himself into a life support system and uploaded his mind into a supercomputer to make him effectively immortal. but his master plan had one flaw. The final OS upgrade to his laser defense system and his securitrons did not arrive to Las Vegas before the bombs fell, forcing Mr. House to use outdated software to protect and maintain control of the city, pushing his systems to the absolute limit. But after 200 years, that missing piece, better known as the Platinum Chip, has finally been located, and Mr. House will stop at nothing to acquire it, to bring his army and weapons to 100% power, and to make New Vegas a shining beacon of hope in the otherwise irradiated world they now lived in, with him as its benevolent ruler. So, now that we know a bit more about the commander and playstyle, let's start looking at the deck itself by starting with the creatures. Since Mr. House is all about us rolling the bones, we'll of course be adding a variety of creatures to our ranks that will enable us to do just that, starting off with some d20 on attack rolling entrants such as Chaos Dragon, whose combination of decent stats, built-in evasion and haste allow us to start rolling dice as soon as it comes down while getting in for decent, if somewhat randomly assigned damage. Lightfoot Rogue, whose ability to grant itself Death Touch as it swings in makes it unlikely to be blocked, which in turn lets us proc Mr. House more often. Hoarding Ogre, who works nicely as another source of repeatable treasure generation as it swings in to provide further ramp while proccing our artifact payoffs. Chaos Channeler, who instead provides value in the form of Impulse Draw as it swings in to net us 1 to 3 more cards per turn. Iron Mastiff, whose ability to roll 3d20s and keep the highest, despite only counting the one we keep for the purposes of Mr. House, further increases the likelihood of us getting the results we want on both its ability to inflict burn and our commander's token creation. And last but certainly not least, the legend Delina Wild Mage, whose ability to create at least one extra temporary but non-legendary copy of Mr. House as she swings in allows us to get even more robots and treasures out of all our die rolling effects to supercharge our artifact token creation, and becomes even better if we can keep rolling 15 plus to roll even more dice and create even more copies. And then to cap off our die rolling creatures, we'll be moving away from d20s and on to d6s as we add in Celebrate 1000, which may roll smaller dice but rolls 2 of them passively each turn to still stack the odds in our favor, all while giving itself access to some decent keywords to better enable it to crack in for damage alongside our other robots. Now, with all our die rolling creatures covered, we'll be wrapping up our dice chucking creature entries by adding in a pair of dice payoffs to the build in the form of Brazen Dwarf, who turns every dice we roll into AoE burn to help whittle down our opponents even faster, and Will Blade of Frontiers, whose passive alone that lets us roll 1 additional die whenever we would roll and ignore the lowest result would be good enough on its own to significantly improve our odds, but his ability to grow as we roll our dice make him even better as an ever-growing threat that our opponents will be forced to deal with or be crushed underneath his potentially enormous stat block. So, with all our dice rolling focused entries in this category covered, let's switch gears to the artifact focused creatures we'll be running in order to get the most out of all the robots and treasures our commander will be creating for us, such as Reckless Fireweaver and Ingenious Artillerist, both of whom turn our artifacts into AoE burn to inflict more passive damage into our opponents as we build up our board. Marionette Master, which instead has a single opponent lose 4 life every single time an artifact we control is sent to the bin, which can easily knock out opponents as soon as it comes down alongside our stockpiles of treasure. Dockside Chef and Stormclaw Rager, each of which can repeatedly consume our spare robots and treasures to generate us card advantage if we find ourselves in need of more resources. Lashiel Clockwork Scholar, who instead generates us card advantage as our robots and other artifact creatures come into play, which we can proc multiple times per rotation if we can engineer ways to roll dice on our opponent's turns, on top of also preventing our artifact creatures from taking damage when they attack so we can crack in with our robots with impunity. And one more legend in the form of Jan Jensen Chaos Crafter, whose ability to turn our spare treasures or other non-creature artifact tokens into more bodies, or our spare artifact creatures into more treasures, works very well alongside all our other artifact-centric payoffs to proc them more often, while letting us swap around our resources between extra bodies and ramp depending on what we need at that moment. Then narrowing down specifically on creatures that care about our treasure generation, since Mr. House will be providing us with a steady flow of it, so we may as well get some extra mileage out of it. we'll be running Academy Manufactor, which tacks on life gain and draw to our treasure generation in the form of food and clue tokens to help pad our life totals and core stats while getting more artifacts and tokens into play for our payoffs. Zorn, which nets us extra treasures as we roll 6+ to kick our ramp and artifact token creation into overdrive. And Professional Facebreaker, which functions as both an extra source of treasure generation as our creatures get in for damage, and a treasure payoff that lets us turn our extra treasures into impulse draw when we need more card advantage rather than ramp. And then as a pair of entrants that care about any tokens we create, not just treasures, we have Nadir's Nightblade and Mirkwood Bats, both of which tack on more AoE burn to our build, the former by turning every token that hits our bin into AoE drain so we can siphon the life out of our opponents while padding our own, and the latter by burning all our opponents as our tokens come down and when we sack them away, which works very well with our treasure generation and artifact sack outlets to chew through our opponents' life totals even faster. And lastly, as a pair of bodyguards to help keep Mr. House alive against our opponent's attempts to remove him and deny us the value he generates, we'll be adding in Bastion Protector and a General's Enforcer to our ranks, both of which make Mr. House indestructible so he can survive against most conventional forms of removal and wipes so long as they stay alive, with the latter even providing some graveyard hate to help us combat against any graveyard-focused builds we may encounter. That covers all our creatures, so let's move on to our instance. Jumping straight back into some more d20 rolling additions to further proc our commander with loaded dice, we'll be slotting in Contraband Livestock, which functions as serviceable on-theme non-destruction creature removal to help pad our core stats, Berserker's Frenzy, whose combat control via forcing blocks can at worst force our opponents to block with their utility creatures so we can get rid of them as we swing in, or at best, prevent blocking altogether when we go in for the Alpha Strike, Revivify, which provides decent board wipe protection that only becomes more and more likely to reanimate our entire board as we commit to it, and Will's Reversal, whose base effect of redirecting a spell or ability is already decent enough at helping keep removal away from our commander or at stealing beneficial effects for ourselves, but its 25+% chance of doubling up on that effect making it even better. Then, as the only non-d20 die rolling effect we'll be running in this slot, we have Six-Sided Die, which may only roll a d6, but can still semi-reliably deal with up to mid-sized creatures while proccing our die rolling payoffs, making it a serviceable removal piece in this build. That said, we'll also want to include some quote-unquote less gimmicky removal options in our arsenal to more reliably deal with our opponent's boards without having to rely on chance, which is why we'll be adding in Path to Exile and Swords to Plowshares as some dirt cheap sources of non-destruction creature removal to help disrupt our opponent's creature base with, as well as Chaos Warp and a Generous Gift as much more flexible removal spells that help us deal with any permanents our opponents throw our way for maximum coverage. Then, to wrap up our instance, we'll be slotting in Deadly Dispute, Costly Plunder, and Reckoner's Bargain as additional ways for us to turn our spare artifact tokens into card advantage so we can keep digging for more resources, with the first also netting us a treasure as it does so to help ramp us or to at least replace the treasure we sacked in order to use it, as well as Demand Answers, which gives us the option to sack an artifact or pitch a card from our hand in order to use it for some additional flexibility, which can be particularly useful in the early game where we may not have artifacts to sack. That covers all our instance, so let's move on to our sorceries. Once again, opening with some d20 chucking entries to proc our commander even more reliably, we have Merkel's Edict, which at worst is a symmetrical AoE edict effect that forces us to sack a spare robot, which we can live with, and at best only affects our opponents while proccing our commander, so we'll run it. Dance Macabre, which functions as another AoE edict effect that, while more expensive, will at least always let us reanimate our creature back, and, if we're lucky, also nets us a creature an opponent sacked as well to further build up our board with, and Recruitment Drive, whose token creation is admittedly subpar on its own, but becomes slightly better alongside Mr. House to net us, on average, between 5/5 and 7/7 worth of stats across 3 bodies and a treasure, making it still worth running here. Then as a pair of non-d20 die rolling entrants, we'll be adding in Attempted Murder, which may only roll d6s but can roll a lot of them as we pump mana into it to serve as both non-destruction creature removal and additional creature token creation to build up our board with, as well as Circus Act, which rolls 3 dice for 3 mana and on average will net us at least 2 1/1 artifact bodies on its own and 1 to 2 3/3 artifacts thanks to our commander to help grow our board even further with tokens that synergize with our artifact-heavy game plan. And then, to round out our sorceries, we'll be running a pair of artifact-centric board wipes in the form of Delete and Organic Extinction, both of which scour the board of all our opponent's non-artifact creatures by either being a scalable damage-dealing wipe that also burns the table as a bonus, or as a much more standard destruction-based wipe that we can use our artifact tokens to help pay for thanks to Improvise, leaving Mr. House and his army of robots untouched after the dust settles for us to take over the game with. That covers all our sorceries, so let's move on to our enchantments. Our enchantment category will only contain 2 entrants, both of which will be primarily focused around manipulating our die rolls to further stack the odds in our favor. Those being Barbarian class, which at level 1 immediately gives us an extra opportunity to roll high on all our die rolls via rolling an additional die when we do so and ignoring the lowest result to more reliably proc our commander, but whose level 2 and 3 abilities shouldn't be ignored as they make our robots hit harder, make them harder to block, and enable them to swing in as soon as they come down to kick their damage output into overdrive, and Night Shift of the Living Dead, which will be primarily playing for its ability to let us bump die roll results by 1 in any direction at the cost of 1 life to do so, which can be the difference between us creating a robot and or a treasure token or not, but whose token creation effect when we roll 6s, which admittedly will happen only rarely since we'll be primarily rolling d20s, is still decent upside to get us even more bodies into play if we're lucky. That covers all our enchantments, so let's move on to our artifacts. Finally reaching our artifact category, we come to our final wave of die rolling entrants to give Mr. House one last wave of support to reliably proc his ability with, starting off with some d20 rolling entrants in the form of Vexing Puzzle Box, which may be expensive but is totally worth running here as both a mana rock that rolls d20s when we use it to consistently proc our commander, while simultaneously being a die rolling / artifact payoff that, given enough time, can tutor any artifact from our deck directly into play for free as a bonus. Component Pouch, which functions as another die rolling mana rock that may be a bit slow initially, but, like the previous entry, gives us another repeatable way to roll d20s at no mana cost, so we'll run it. Treasure Chest, whose effects may be a bit random but 95% of the time are beneficial by either ramping us with more treasure creation, netting us card advantage, or, on a result of 20, tutoring up anything from our deck while proccing our die rolling payoffs. Wand of Wonder, which may be expensive to activate, but between it proccing our commander and netting us at least 1 free spell off of our opponents every time we use it, making it worth running here. And finally, the Deck of Many Things, whose effects are again random but largely beneficial, providing us with graveyard recursion, card advantage, and even potentially a win condition we can easily proc via our sack effects if we get lucky, though we will be wanting to use it only if we're low on cards in hand or have ways to load the die roll in our favor to avoid having to discard down to nothing. Then closing up our die rolling entrance with some non-d20 rolling entries, we have Clown Car, which rolls as many d6s as we can pump mana into it to give us multiple opportunities to proc Mr. House, while flooding the board with artifact creature tokens and or creating a giant vehicle for us as it does so. Strength Testing Hammer, whose equip cost may be a bit steep, but does passively roll us a d6 whenever the equipped creature swings in, pumping the creature's power based on the result, and can even occasionally draw us a card if the creature ends up having the highest power on the board, somewhat ironically making it swingy but still worth running, especially when considering the decent number of creatures we already have with on-attack die rolling effects. Ebony Fly, which initially functions as a slow but serviceable mana rock that we can later use to roll a d6 and turn it into a flying XX based on the result that grants flying to another creature as it swings in, which may be expensive to use but is still very much worth running here to get our non-evasive on-attack d20 rolling creatures in safely on more crowded board states. And, as our final die rolling entry, Sword of Ours, whose ability to grow our equipped creature with +1/+1 counters as it swings in makes it more likely to survive combat, which again helps keep our on-attack die rollers alive, and, interestingly, provides us with a d12 roll if a creature gets in for damage to potentially make it even bigger via its counter-doubling effect, while giving us a better-than-average chance at proccing Mr. House in the process. Now, with the entirety of our die rolling suite covered, we'll be switching gears into ways to further harden Mr. House's defenses against our opponent's attempts to remove him, in which we'll be adding in the classic Lightning Greaves and Swiftfoot Boots, both of which provide cheap and reliable targeting protection in the form of either Shroud or Hexproof, and, as a bonus, allow us to make use of Mr. House's activated ability as soon as he comes down instead of having to wait a full rotation, as well as the somewhat odd inclusion, Whisper Silk Cloak, which may seem like a strange choice at first considering our commander's an 0/4 that doesn't need the evasion it provides, but it makes it in due to this build having 8 cards that are attack-dependent sources of die rolls, allowing us to get repeated uses out of them instead of swinging in with them only once, having them die to blockers, and then us being down a die rolling effect, making it less of an exclusive source of targeting protection to protect our commander with, and more of a piece that we can use to keep him alive until we hit an on-attack die rolling creature that can make better use of the evasion it provides. And then to close out our artifacts, we'll be adding in a suite of ramp sources to improve our mana base with, consisting of the Mana Rock's Soul Ring, Arcane Signet, Boros Signet, Orzhov Signet, and Rakdos Signet, along with the land ramp source Wayfarer's Bauble, all of which are inexpensive and help speed up and fix our 3-color mana base. That covers all our artifacts, and since we won't be running any planeswalkers in this build, let's skip straight on to our land base. Quickly going over this build's mana lands, we have Command Tower, Nomad Outpost, and Path of Ancestry as a trio of lands that tap for all our colors for added consistency, with a third also providing repeatable scry thanks to the 10 humans we'll be running in this build, the check lands Clifftop Retreat, Dragonskull Summit, and Isolated Chapel, the reveal lands Fury Column Snarl, Foreboding Ruins, and Shine Shadow Snarl, and the battle land Smoldering Marsh, all of which tap for 2 of our colors and take advantage of our basics to usually come into play untapped to provide us with even more reliable access to our colors without sacrificing speed, and the filter lands Desolated Mire, Shadowblood Ridge, and Sunscorched Divide to give us one last bit of fixing that comes into play untapped to improve our access to our colors just a bit more. Then, as our lone utility land, we'll be running Rogue's Passage, which we'll be using to grant evasion to our die rolling on attack creatures so they can reliably proc Mr. House even on the most clogged of board states. And finally, we'll be running 6 plains, 7 swamps, and 9 mountains as our basics to close out our land base. So, now that we've covered all the cards in the deck, let's take a look at this deck's breakdown. Looking at the stats that matter to our game plan, we have 18 cards that roll d20s and 9 cards that roll smaller dice to give Mr. House as many sources of dice chucking effects as possible to reliably proc his token creation, 6 cards that care about die rolls to generate us extra value or to stack the odds further in our favor as we roll the bones, 14 cards that care about artifacts, 4 cards that care about treasures, and 2 cards that care about tokens to weaponize the artifact tokens our commander creates even further, by turning them into more damage against our opponents or more value for ourselves, 5 sources of targeting and/or destruction protection to help keep Mr. House alive for longer against our opponent's attempts to remove him so he can keep generating us value, and 3 sources of evasion to make it slightly easier for our on-attack sources of die rolling to swing in safely and repeatedly. For general deck stats, we have 15 ramp sources, 14 card draw sources, 11 targeted removal sources, and 2 board wipes. Our ramp and draw being slightly higher than average due to our deck's ability to generate treasures and cast spells rather quickly, requiring us to have ways to replenish our resources equally as fast. Looking at our mana curve, we have an average CMC of 2.77, leaving us with a relatively low-to-the-ground mana curve that aims to aggressively dig for repeatable sources of die-rolling effects to reliably proc Mr. House, flooding the board with artifact tokens as we keep rolling dice, and then converting those tokens into damage as we crack in with our robots, and/or burn out our opponents via our artifact/token payoffs. Currently, this deck is valued at $64.88, not counting the price of basic lands or shipping. This price was calculated by using the cheapest listed marketplace price on TCG Player at the time of this recording. Now, if we would like to side grade our deck more in one direction or another without going over budget, we can consider exchanging some of our one-shot die rolling spells like Six-Sided Die, Revivify, and Recruitment Drive, with attraction opening effects such as Lifetime Pass Holder, Deadbeat Attendant, and Step Right Up, which may only roll d6s, but passively do so each turn to give us more opportunities to proc Mr. House, and, on top of that, give us access to the effects of the attractions themselves to generate us more card advantage removal and artifact token creation to further fuel our game plan. Then, if we want to upgrade the build by going over budget, we can instead exchange out Recruitment Drive for Comet Stellar Pup, whose die rolling loyalty ability may be a bit random but is generally good at building up our board with tokens, recurring resources, and/or inflicting damage, while his ability to generate exploding sixes can generate us a lot of value all at once if we keep rolling hot. Revivify can be traded out for Maddening Hex, which can potentially net us multiple d6 rolls per rotation to proc our payoffs while slowly burning out our opponents as they cast their non-creature spells, and if we want the biggest bang for the biggest bucks, we can replace Marionette Master, Nadir's Nightblade, and Strength Testing Hammer with Ancient Gold Dragon, Ancient Brass Dragon, and Ancient Copper Dragon, all of which are huge, evasive d20 rolling beatsticks whose effects would be powerful enough on their own even if we didn't get any extra value out of them through Mr. House, by either flooding the board with evasive bodies, mass reanimating creatures from any players' graveyards under our control, or creating huge stockpiles of treasures all at once, provided of course we're willing to contribute a hefty sum of our own hard-earned cash into these dragons' hordes for their services. Thanks everyone for sticking around until the end of the video. Firstly, before we continue, I'd like to take a moment to thank all of the channel subscribers for having helped the channel reach its 18.7k subscriber milestone. Sincerely, thank you all for your continued support, as this channel could not continue growing without it. So, with Mr. House covered, the next commander we'll be covering will be the aptly named Massacre Girl Known Killer, who will be featuring in a toughness-reducing build focused around turning our opponent's creatures into husks for fun and profit, which will then follow up with the back-to-back precon upgrades for Outlaws of Thunder Junction. So look forward to those builds coming soon. And again, before we close out, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy this content. Consider donating to buy me a coffee or use my Game Nerds affiliate link if you want to support the channel directly. And if you'd like to see more videos like this one, either click on the videos floating around my head for the latest builds, or click on the card above for a playlist of all the deck techs I've made so far. And with that, have a good one folks, and stay safe.